Hello, my name is Kemper Donovan. I am the co host of the All About Agatha podcast. You'll be meeting my co host, Catherine Brobeck, in just a moment for the upcoming interview we did as part of the International Agatha Christie Festival at Home Edition. For those who haven't listened to the podcast, I should explain that we, like you, are devotees of Christie, so much so that we have spent the last 4 years and counting devoted to a close study and celebration of Christie's texts. We're even trying to systematically rank all 66 of Christie's novels, which, as you can imagine, is quite an involved endeavor, but one that we deeply enjoy and cherish. If you'd like to check us out, you can go to Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever you may listen to podcasts and put All About Agatha in the search field. Our nifty little Art Deco inspired logo should pop right up. And now let's begin the interview. It is such an honor and a thrill to be sitting here on this computer screen, as it were, with Matthew Pritchard. He is the longtime former head of Agatha Christie Limited, which has been managing the literary and media rights to Agatha Christie's works all around the world since 1955, which was when the company was set up by Christie herself. Matthew is the only son of Rosalind Hicks, who, as many of you probably already know, is the only daughter of Agatha Christie, which makes him Agatha Christie's only grandchild. So, Matthew, please believe me when I say that getting the opportunity to speak to you is a dream come true for both of us, Christie super fans that we are. So I just wanted to start by thanking you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an even greater pleasure to talk to you without either of us having to get onto an aeroplane, particularly as times. I spent many happy days in Los Angeles, but I think I'm very happy to be at home and talking to you now because it's not a nice place to be outside at the moment in the world, is it?
Absolutely. Well, it certainly makes logistics easier.
That's true. Although I think that I can speak for Comfort and myself when I say that, we're a little bit regretting that circumstances weren't different so that we couldn't all see each other in person in Turkey.
Yeah.
We were all looking forward to, I think.
Yeah, I mean, my son, who now runs Agatha Christie Limited, and I think I forget there's 11 or 12 people who work for us, and they've been working from home since March. And although I think they all now, reached a consensus that although they'd much rather be back in the office for 2 or 3 days a week, they hope they never have to go back to an office for 5 days a week because
I hope that's our takeaway from all of this is that, we should all have a little bit more flexibility and that nobody needs to be under fluorescent lights all day.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, it's lovely to talk to you and on one of my favorite subjects anyway.
Well, I mean, to start off, again, this is supposed to be a big festival this year because it is celebrating something incredible. It's the centenary of the publication of The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And so I think just to start out from a macro perspective, I guess we were wondering in that 100 years, which is incredible. And I think that what we have found is that the readership and the appreciation for Agatha has only grown, and you see a new interest even today. We've heard from, booksellers and librarians that some of the things that have been sort of most bought and taken off the shelves during this lockdown have been, in fact, Christie books. And so, I find that fascinating. And for you, speaking on 100 years of publication, I guess, what do you see in the changes in readership and the fans from when, your grandmother first started publishing to today?
Well, I suppose to start off with something that's so obvious it's almost not worth saying. There are far more readers now than there were 100 years ago. I don't know how many copies Mysterious Affair at Styles were first published, but all I can tell you is that if a copy of Mysterious Affair at Styles with its original cover comes on the market now, it fetches a fortune. So I think you could probably measure that in hundreds, probably. And now the people who read Agatha Christie over the world can probably be measured in millions. And I think that is very remarkable. And if my grandmother was with us today, I think she would be more than a little surprised, I think, that since she died in 1976, so to speak, Agatha Christie mania has grown rather than subsided. And, you know, without her help, I mean, Curtain was published after her death, and but you know, by and large, without her help. And in case you should be kind enough to say this, without much help from me either. I mean, I think this has all happened through the enthusiasm and skill of publishers, agents, film producers, actors and actresses, all that kind of thing. But where I used to, when I was chairman of Agatha Christie Limited, I think the one thing that really was impressed upon me was that how almost everybody we met in a professional capacity was there because they loved Agatha Christie. It was okay, it was work, but it was really a part of their lives. And some of them quite famous people, cabinet ministers, everybody who sort of, and I always tell people that of all the, when people sort of discover who I was, and still happens today, you know, oh, you're Agatha Christie's grandson, and nobody has, or if I say that, nobody has ever asked me who was she. And I think that, you know, in 40 or 50 years, that's quite an achievement. I mean, you might say that about Tiger Woods, as you're, I think Tiger Woods is up the road from you in San Francisco at the moment. You probably wouldn't have to ask who he was, but I can't think of many other people. Perhaps not even your president, but we better not get on dangerous ground.
Well, Matthew, off the record, if you want to, go down that road when we're done talking here, I think we'd be happy to go along with you.
No, that's such a good point, and I think it kind of segues nicely into what my next question was, which is that for so many people, Agatha Christie is such an institution that, you know, when people are referring to the name, they're often referring to the books themselves as opposed to a person. Like, oh, what are you reading right now? An Agatha Christie, you know, which I was thinking must be a little bit strange for the grandson of Agatha Christie, who of course knew Agatha Christie as a person. So just in terms of who she was, I wanted to start off with two questions, which is, first of all, what did you call her as her grandson? And then secondly, is there anything about her that may not be obvious to all these many readers and fans scattered across the globe who only know her as a writer? Is there anything about her as a person that might surprise us to learn?
Well, the first question is easy. I used to call her Nima, spelled Nima, and I'm told the reason for this was that was my first attempt when I was very young at grandma. Now, you may think that isn't even close, but that apparently is what I said. And the Nima stuck as a family name for her for the whole of my life, well, the whole of her life. And she died when I was about 33 or 34, I think. So it was a long-lasting name, but that's what we all used to call her. And the one thing I am very pleased of is that we did have a family name, because the first thing that your viewers may not realize is that there were undoubtedly three strands in her life that were most important to her. Obviously writing, obviously archaeology, and the third was family. And, you know, I'm very pleased and very proud to have had a part in inventing a family name, because I think probably family was more important to her than the other two. And that's perhaps something which your viewers may not realize, because I think there were various incidents in her life which sort of brought this home to her. The first was her own very happy childhood, and she came to realize at a very early stage how important family was. And then, she grew up and went through all the process of growing up as a teenager and finally got married. And then, sadly, she got divorced. And that, again, showed her what she missed when, for a short time, she didn't have a family. And then she got married again, and the same thing happened all over again, and she became devoted to family. And then I was born. This is a very short, so to speak, cycle of her life. Then I was born, and sadly, my father was killed in the Second World War, and there was family trouble again. And so once again, my grandmother, heaved to and came down to see us in Wales and looked after me and my mother, and then was a sort of a closer family, which lasted really for the rest of all our lives. And I think that was very important to her, and it was certainly very important to me. My wife Lucy has hundreds of cousins and aunts and uncles and all sorts of things like that. I actually have very few. I have a mother who was an only child. I'm an only child, and I have actually very few cousins. So family is very important to me, and it was to her as well. And I think I probably learnt it from her. So I think the other thing that perhaps your viewers won't realize is that she was a very modest person. I can hardly ever remember discussing her writing with her, except in the most general possible terms. She was much more willing to discuss all the things that I enjoyed doing than she was to discuss all the things that she enjoyed doing. And the other thing that your viewers won't know is that she was a very devout person and lived with a copy of the Imitation of Christ by her bedside, went to church where she could, in many countries. I don't think she was too fussy. I mean, she was obviously a devout Christian, but I don't think she was beyond going into a Muslim church in the Middle East. She was very broad-minded and devout and modest, and the other thing which I think I have caught from her, a great enthusiasm, but not only about books and archaeology and, dare I say, me and her family, but she was a terrific enthusiast about everything. I mean, she collected things like mad, like silver and boxes and all sorts of things. But does that give you a picture?
It truly does. I mean, and one of the things that we, one of our recurring themes in our podcast as we're discussing Christie is this underlying humanism in her work, which if you really do read the text closely and you read enough of them, does come through. And this notion of faith, I think actually in one of the last episodes we just did, I was actually talking about that you can feel it, this undercurrent in the text. And that's such a strange thing to say about a collection of murder mysteries in which people are murdering other people, but that's what she does, and it's part of, I think, what's so powerful about them and why they have endured, because I think people respond to that faith in humanity that does underlie these extremely clever and often cynical and so many other emotions that might cut across that faith. It still endures underneath it, and there's a power to that. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that, I mean, she thought life was for living, and she did it to the full, and whether she was working or playing, so to speak. And I think the enthusiasm for life and a willingness to enjoy things, that comes out in the books too. And the other thing is, of course, that she told marvelous stories. And when we're thinking of how these stories have lived for 100 years, the fact is that they're all wonderful stories. And even now, you may believe this or not as you choose, but I quite often pick up an Agatha Christie when I go to bed and just open it in the middle and start reading. I think a lot of people do that.
For sure. I mean, I
We
think
certainly do.
definitely so. And it's interesting. Kemper and I have a terrible soft spot for Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quinn. And we were talking about, this sort of humanism and faith elements, and also the idea fundamentally underlying those, right, is that life is for living, which is, they have a different quality than some of the other mysteries. And I think that Kemper and I, have a particular appreciation for how personal they seem and how sort of poignant they are. So, that really struck me with what you were saying as well.
Yeah. I'm going to go off piste here. You said you talked about Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. One of the stories in that book, called The Man from the Sea, is one of my favorite things that Nima wrote. And I have actually been to Tenerife, and I've been to the site where this book was imagined. And I also went to an Agatha Christie festival in Tenerife, which is where it was imagined. And I remember, as chairman of Agatha Christie Limited, that whoever was running the festival said, "Is there anything you would like me to do a dramatic presentation of?" And I said airily, "Well, why don't you do The Man from the Sea?" Because that was written in Tenerife. And then on the plane over, when I got there, I said to my then wife, Angela, I said, "Why on earth did I say that? Because it's bound to be awful and nothing like I imagined it," and all this kind of thing. Anyway, we went to the performance, and it was an absolute revelation. And the lady who played the woman, I can't remember her name now, but was absolutely marvelous. It had a sort of eerie, almost spiritual feeling about it, which I think the story does. And it remains one of my favorite stories. And if I had one wish for the rest of my life, it would be if somebody did a really professional staging of The Man from the Sea, because I think it's just a wonderful story, and it has everything Nima, it has a twist at the end, and it has, a wonderful beginning. And Mr. Quinn, I think, is at his, how can I put this, at his most enigmatic.
That's for sure. It's quite an exit. He makes quite an exit in that story.
Yeah. And I'm afraid, forgotten what the question was.
No, actually, I think that was a far better answer to the question than the question was, because I think that you're just speaking to exactly what we both feel about those stories as well. So I'm happy to hear that is your favorite, because we love that story.
On my trip to Tenerife, we must get off Tenerife in a minute, but on my trip to Tenerife, we went out on a cruise ship, and I read The Man from the Sea to a group of people on the boat. And I think the people who organized the entertainment on the boat thought about sort of 20 people would turn up. And I don't know how many did, but they were in the hundreds. And we all sat in this big room, and I read The Man from the Sea. And I promise you, you could hear a pin drop. And to me, that spoke volumes about the quality of the writing and the story. And for the rest of the voyage, which was 3 or 4 days, people kept on coming up to see me and say, "Oh, we thought we knew all Agatha Christie, but we'd never heard that one before." And people actually say that quite often. And, but anyway, let's move on before I get too enthusiastic.
Yes, we could probably talk about Tenerife for hours. Last thing I'll say about this is one of my most thrilling discoveries in doing close readings for our podcast was noting that the opening to The Man from the Sea is so similar to the opening in the Mary Westmacott novel Unfinished Portrait, which is also coming from such a personal place, and seeing the relation between the two was also I think it informs both those stories actually, and how personal they were. So
Did you know that the street which leads down from the lady's house to the shore is now called Calle Agatha Christie?
oh my gosh, wow. There's a life goal
Yeah.
for all of us. Wow.
There's a statue of Mr. Quinn there as well, isn't there?
Yes, there is. Yeah, I think, yes.
Yes, it's like the two of them talking in a garden or something like that. Yes. So, well, if you know what, if anyone watching this interview has not yet read the Mr. Quinn stories, and in particular that one, then let's let that be the takeaway, that that collection is worth revisiting, because we're constantly talking about that as well. So,
Good.
so I was curious how you came to read the Christie of, since you're in a very particular and odd position, given that you're Agatha Christie's grandson, and given that you were born when she was in the middle of her career, because obviously she wrote quite a few of her books before you were in existence, and then she wrote many of her books while you were, and while you I would presume were reading them as she was publishing them. So in terms of the backlog, as it were, I'm curious how you approached reading those earlier novels, and if you had any advice coming from either your mother or even your grandmother as to which you should tackle first, or anything of that nature.
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I can't remember anybody giving me any advice at all. I remember that the first one I read was what is now called And Then There Were None. And I was then about 10 or 11. And I think it did surprise me a bit because at that stage, before I read it, of course, I didn't really know. I mean, I knew vaguely that her stories were about murders, but that's about all. And, but I enjoyed it. And then I think I read a Poirot story. It could have been ABC Murders. But it was sort of, as far as a sort of logical answer to the question, it was a fairly random selection. I used to pick one up at Greenway, where we used to go for the summer, and read it. And then when I'd finished that one, I'd pick up another one. But I don't remember ever asking which I should read next. Or, I mean, people quite often other people ask me that now, but when I did it, nobody did. So I just went on reading them. And I remember thinking, but I didn't dare say this to anybody. I remember thinking, oh, she hasn't written a bad one yet. And, and we might come on to that in a minute. But I don't really think that I did have a list. I think my mother might have muttered. I mean, I think the first few I read, I think were all Poirot's. My mother might have said to me, she did write about another character called Miss Marple. So then I read a few Miss Marples. I think things like that happened, but I don't think there was, and I know my mother loved Miss Marple anyway. So, I think, and I remember in about 1950, I wasn't quite old enough for that. It must have been a bit later. I think I do remember telling Nima that I had read A Murder Is Announced, and her saying, "Oh, that was one of my favorites. I read that myself again the other day, and I thought it was rather good," she said. And I won't mention the name, but she said, and so is one of my favorite murderers.
Yeah.
So there you are.
It's one of
and going on to what I think is the second part of your question, what did I do about the books which were published, when I'd started reading them? And the answer to that is that they almost all came out sort of in November, December time, because we had this great phrase, which I'm sure you've heard, called A Christie for Christmas. And at that stage, I was at boarding school, and I used to receive the new book in a package wrapped up in brown paper and string at my school, and for me to read at school. And when I was at my sort of first boarding school, when I was sort of 8 till 13 or something, during the last of those few years, all books that you had sent to you in that way had to be sent to the headmaster, and he just put his initials in them to make sure you were reading suitable literature. And it occurred to me after a year or two that Agatha Christie's were taking rather a long time to come home to me. And I eventually discovered, after I left the school, actually, that the headmaster's wife was a great fan, and he used to read them quickly before sending them back to me. So that was what I would describe now as an abuse of privilege. But there you go.
I understand.
Nicking the students' packages is a little bit.
Yeah, and you know, and after that, well, you know, by the time I left school and university, I suppose I was in my early 20s, and there was still a lot of books to go. And I mean, I just read them at home, and I you know, waited for the latest Agatha Christie with probably just as much enthusiasm as the general public.
What was it like to pick up, you know, And Then There Were None at 10 years old and realize that your Nima had actually crafted a series of very gruesome murders in a novel?
Well, I think one of the, as Kemper said, you know, earlier on, I mean, I think one of the things about the murders is, I admit Then There Were None is a slight exception here, but most of them are not actually terribly gruesome. You know, I mean, in And Then There Were None, there was somebody stung by a bee. There was admittedly somebody who was axed. That was a bit unusual. But even, you know, 10 or 11, you can take that in your stride, I think. And you know, I think that it was the tension, and, you know, when you get to the end, and you know, the wrong, as far as I was concerned, the wrong things used to happen, and the person who you suspected of doing the whole thing suddenly turned up dead. This was much more the cause of anguish than anything to do with gruesomeness. You know, and I remember saying to Nima some years later, you know, the first book I read was And Then There Were None, and she said, "Oh, I don't think I would have recommended you read that when you were 10." But I said, no, I got on fine, you know.
Well, I mean, I think the gruesome was the wrong word choice, because actually everything incredibly violent happens. Even the axing in that happens far off page, so we don't really see any of it. But I sort of just meant the fact that, you know, to find out that one's grandmother is a brilliant plotter of murder is, you know, I guess I would have been a little bit surprised to have found that out about my own grandparents.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it was helped, as I said earlier. I mean, we didn't really talk about writing when we were at home. So to me, she was still Nima, who took me down to the river and below Greenway House in Devon, and we watched the ships coming up the river, and then we walked the dog back up to the house, and we had a cream tea, and we played croquet and all that kind of thing. Those things were very much a part of my childhood, and were much more important, really, than what she did with the rest of her time. You know, I remember being very disappointed that I never saw her in the spring holidays, because she was always in Iraq. You know, I don't think the subject of what she wrote really bothered me at all.
I mean, I would have been delighted. So.
Me too.
I think it was really when the plays began in the sort of middle 1950s, that, so to speak, as far as I'm concerned, took her fame up a notch, because in those days, when we didn't really have, well, certainly television didn't dominate our lives in the way it does now, but plays and first nights and how long they ran and all that kind of thing. They were the subject of family conversation, and they were the subject of, interviews on papers, and Nima getting agitated because she didn't know how long they were going to go on. And I think that it was the plays that perhaps first made me realize that she was actually not only a writer, but somebody who the world out there really recognized. And when I, at the end of my school days, when I was 17 to 18, she took me to music festivals in Europe. We went to Salzburg and Bayreuth. And to Bayreuth, she actually went under an assumed name, which only lasted the 24 hours before somebody recognized her. But, it was a gradual process, but the plays were a very important part of me finally recognizing that I had a famous grandmother.
We recently actually were just discussed Spider's Web. And, we're marveling over the fact that there was that period in the mid 50s when she had 3 plays on the West End all at once, Witness for the Prosecution, Spider's Web, and of course the Mousetrap. And no other female playwright has ever done that. So, I mean, just fabulously successful in that moment.
Well, a friend of mine called Julius Green has just written a book called Curtain Up about all Agatha Christie's plays. And I think I wouldn't dare say this to Julius, but it goes downhill from his first sentence about, Agatha. It said the first sentence is, Agatha Christie was the greatest playwright the world has ever seen, full stop. She also read some books.
We've used Julius's book as a reference for especially those episodes having to do with plays, and there really is this through line. It's almost like a running joke through the book that he really just wants to minimize Agatha Christie as a novelist, and he's like, well, this was really her passion, and he's making a fair point, but it is amusing that he might be the only Christie scholar who's dedicated to just sort of minimizing her impact and passion for novel writing. It is.
When you meet him, it's even worse.
Well, I think we also wanted to touch on adaptations, because that is, of course, such a huge part of the world of Christie at this point. There have been so many adaptations in so many languages all over the world, and these adaptations, fans feel very strongly about them. There's always a lot of passion in either direction on them, I think, because people are so passionate about the text. And I'm just curious, having been the head of Agatha Christie Limited, having been involved in many of these adaptations, if you could just identify a couple of your favorites or ones that come to mind that you're particularly proud of having brought to life.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I wouldn't claim at all that all the adaptations that were made, so to speak, under my stewardship were huge successes. I mean, they were commercially very successful, but some were better than others. And the first thing I'd like to do is to pay a huge tribute to my mother, who made a huge contribution in this particular area and helped the producers and the scriptwriters when they'd allow her to. And the contributions that she made, I mean, for instance, with David Suchet's Poirot stories, would never have lasted the length of time they did without her careful stewardship and help and an innate understanding of the way my grandmother wrote the stories and all that kind of thing. But as far as favorites, I mean, of the original Poirot series, the ABC Murders is probably my favorite. And of the Miss Marples, I think, rather like the book, A Murder is Announced, is a wonderful story, although I have a sneaking love for The Pocketful of Rye, which starts off with a famous British actor called Timothy West dying a grisly death, which gets the evening off to a rattling good start. And I think that one of my favorite stories which happened under my stewardship was actually happened to be the last one that happened under my stewardship, which was the BBC's And Then There Were None, which had a marvellous cast and a script written by Sarah Phelps, which, unlike some of her later efforts, stuck religiously to the original story, and was, in my opinion, and I don't mind if she watches this, was all the better for it. But it was an absolutely marvellous production, and I'm not ashamed to say now that I was very proud of it.
The production values of that particular adaptation are incredible. It's so beautifully shot that you know, I mean, it just sparkles, I think.
Yeah, well, you know, I hope Damien Timmer, who is the producer, is watching that, because I mean, that watching you, because that is really what he really was trying to convince the BBC and the public, that Agatha Christie actually was, so to speak, suitable for adaptations of this kind. You haven't very tactfully asked me what was the worst adaptation that occurred. But I'll tell you that too, because we all hated MGM's Margaret Rutherford, Miss Marples. At least two of which weren't even based on proper Agatha Christie's at all, as far as I remember. And even the ones that were, you had to struggle with all your might to discover what the similarities were between what you were watching on the screen and what my grandmother originally wrote. You know, fortunately, we were able to bring that particular relationship to an end. But and strangely enough, Margaret Rutherford was a great friend of Nima's, and I'm not sure the relationship survived that particular episode in Margaret Rutherford's life, but they were terrible, and it took us a long, long time to get over that.
They're not just, you know, not very good. They're baffling. They're baffling to watch, because they really, as you said, have very little connection at all to the works that they're based on.
I think the two that, I'm speaking from memory here, the two that didn't actually even pretend to be adaptations were Murder at the Gallop and Murder at Sea, or Murder Ahoy. That's
Murder
right.
Ahoy. Yeah, I think Murder Ahoy, I think, is the one that is the most unmoored, to use a nautical reference from
anyway, I thought you might enjoy that, but let's now move on to something more.
Of course. Yeah. So it's still just staying on the adaptations a little bit. You know, there have been a few contemporary adaptations of Christie, and we're speaking now in terms of English language adaptations, because those are the ones that we've watched. But for the most part, the adaptations have been period, right? Usually the period in which they were written, or if not, you know, a period close to it. That certainly was the case for the Suchet series and the Hickson series. And I'm just curious if you think that there's an opportunity in future, since we all seem to not be able to get enough of Christie, there will be more adaptations to come, if there would be an opportunity to contemporize it in the same sort of, you know, clever way that was done with the Sherlock series recently. If that's something that, you know, would appeal and is, you know, being contemplated.
Well, I would be the first. I mean, the first thing I'd like to say on that particular subject is I believe it is possible to contemporize, if that's the word, Agatha Christie. And I would also be the first to admit that so far, in my opinion, we have never done that successfully. I don't know whether you count the Warner Brothers films in the 1950s, Murder is Easy, Sparkling Cyanide. I think there was a Miss Marple with Helen Hayes. I mean, they were more contemporary, but I'm not even sure. I mean, they might have been contemporary in the 50s. I can't really remember, but you know, but they were. You know, I became very friendly with the president of Warner Brothers Television in those days, who was a lovely man called Alan Shane, married to a very good artist who I always regretted never having bought a picture from, but that's neither here nor there. But I believe it is possible, and I think the nearest that we've got to doing something like that was the Agatha Christie episode in our series over here called Doctor Who.
Oh,
Did you ever see that?
oh yes.
I thought that was brilliant, and I'll tell you a funny story about that, because whilst I was at my desk at Agatha Christie Limited one day, my assistant said to me, somebody from the BBC wants to be in touch with you because they've written a script, an Agatha Christie script, and they've suddenly realized they haven't got permission for it. So this was about 3 weeks before it was due to be transmitted. So anyway, I said, well, why don't they send me the script and we'll see what we're going to do. Anyway, it was quite clear. I can't even remember who played my grandmother, or I can remember it had something to do with a wasp, but
Yes, absolutely. Giant wasp, a giant alien wasp. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember who played Nima?
I don't. She was playing her in the 30s, so it was a younger, it was a young actor. I don't remember.
Anyway, that was fairly contemporary, and I thought that was a success. But I'm happy to tell you that we had nothing whatsoever to do with the production, because they did it completely without asking us. Typical BBC, dare I say, but no, they don't do that very often, actually.
Well, that episode is also quite a bit of a fan letter, because it makes about 400 puns based on Agatha Christie titles during it. So
That's right.
Yeah, we covered that episode once, and we said, I think, our final word on it is, you can tell that was written by a true lover of the text, like someone who really did the work.
Yeah, I think was he called Andrew Davis, the fellow who wrote it? I can't. He was quite famous anyway.
Yeah.
But he made a really good job of it, and but I still think, to come back to my original answer to your question, I still think there is room for Agatha Christie to be adapted in a modern way. I'm not sure exactly like Sherlock, but I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And who knows? It might actually happen.
Well, that's
a very, very interesting production, which will be made next year sometime. I can't tell you much about it, except that it's being made in Swedish. And that is the best contemporary modern Agatha Christie that I have read. I mean, I've only read the script, but it is brilliant.
This doesn't have to do with the Sven Hjersen.
Yeah, it does, yes.
It is. Oh, we just, there are no secrets on the internet. So we heard a little.
We were just talking about this the other day.
Yeah.
Well, I'm waiting with bated breath to see what it actually comes out like on the screen. But reading it on the written page, it sounds wonderful.
Here's my only, and if this is something that you don't wish to answer, that's fine. I'm just so curious, because it's a Swedish production, but Sven Hjersen is a Finnish detective.
Yeah, well, I've never really understood the relationship between the Scandinavian nations, but I think it is genuinely a Scandinavian production, but it is also, a partner in the production is a German television company, so it gets even worse. But
I'm being too provincial.
A genuinely foreign language project, and this was brought into being by my son, and he ought to be very proud of himself. I thought it was marvelous.
It sounds I can't wait for it. It sounds I'm clearly being too provincial in my sort of trying to parse the productions of it. So I'm sure it's just a group effort there in terms of a lot of different countries, and usually things are the better for that. So yeah, we're really looking forward to that. I had one other question on adaptations, which is just that to date there are now at this point only 3 Agatha Christie novels that haven't gotten any adaptation whatsoever. Those are Destination Unknown, Passenger to Frankfurt, and Postern of Fate. I would have been put on Death Comes as the End as the last one on that list, but there is a Death Comes as the End that is actually coming out shortly, which we are also extremely excited for.
I'm not sure about that actually, but anyway.
Okay.
You might have to include that as well.
Oh, okay.
But the answer to your question is, I think there are probably very good reasons for those 3 or 4 titles not having been adapted before, and strange enough, they are all different. I mean, I think Poston of Fate what was, I think, how can I put it? I think it was the only book that Nima wrote, which I think it was perhaps a bit of a shame, and I think if she's watching this, she might agree with me. It's the only book she wrote that perhaps she would wish she'd stopped a book earlier. And I think I'm pleased Poston of Fate hasn't. And I think it was all built around my grandmother's dog, who was called Treacle, who actually used to belong to me. But it never, to my mind, reached the standards of almost the whole of the rest of her repertoire. Passenger to Frankfurt was, I think, written about a subject that, basically terrorism and all that kind of thing. And I think would have been hard to find a television buyer for, because, it sailed a bit, and I don't know, I'm sure you've read the introduction to Passenger to Frankfurt. You should read it again recently, because with all the terrorism that we're suffering at the moment, there are some very perceptive words written by Nima before Passenger to Frankfurt comes in. And, it's always been, we've had people who've nibbled at Passenger to Frankfurt, but they've all shied away from it. Destination Unknown is based on a brilliant idea of somebody who wants to commit suicide and is persuaded to take on an impossible project, which will almost certainly achieve her death, so to speak. But I think the rest of the book doesn't live up to the brilliance of the original idea. And, we were faced, I think at one stage, I do remember this, we were faced with somebody who had written made an attempt at the book that Nima wrote, but somehow forgot about the brilliant idea that never appeared in the adaptation. So that never took place. But, they are all individual. I don't say they'll never happen, but, maybe Netflix will do them all. I don't know. Death Comes as the End ought to have been done 20 or 30 years ago. And, we actually, or a film producer actually employed an artist to do sort of designs for all the clothes and things like that. But, I mean, the reason why Death Comes as the End has never been done, I think, is simply money. It's far too expensive.
Yes, it would be an extremely, talk about period. That is quite a period piece. Well, it's funny, Matthew, I think that I know the answer to this question based on something that you said earlier. I was curious if you had any memories of your grandmother or your Nima, I should say, in the midst of her writing process, or talking about what she was writing. Again, I think I know the answer to that. And it doesn't surprise me, just because one of our few critiques of her delightful autobiography, which is a personal favorite of mine, I think sometimes I say, if I had to pick my favorite Christie, it might actually be her autobiography, just because it's such a delight to read, but has been so useful to us in learning more about her and referencing her life as we're doing our podcast. But she hardly talks about her writing in that either. So it seems as though she just, that kind of modesty, was prevailed in the writing of the autobiography. But, were there any moments that come to mind in terms of maybe you observing her writing process from afar?
Well, you say you know the answer to that question, and I fear you do, because she hardly ever talked about her writing, not only to me, but to any of us. Although I think she did. She certainly didn't talk to my mother, because my mother was fiercely critical of her work, in a kind sort of way, and only individually to her own mother. So she would rather die than criticize Agatha Christie to anybody else. But but she was like that. So, but she, I do remember her saying, and I don't think she said this to me, I think I heard this on an interview, that, she said, started off, people are always asking me how I write my books, and the truth is that I don't really know. And, I don't think she was terribly scientific about it, but they seem to get done. And I do remember when she lived in Wallingford, which was near Oxford and not very far from where I was at school. I remember seeing the room in which she wrote, which had a dictaphone on a card table in the middle of the room, and a dog basket underneath the card table, and a notepad, and that was it. That was, and I remember she said a lot earlier than that, all I need to write on a book, is a sturdy wooden table. I think to her it was a very well-worn. I think when she got older, she did find the writing process very tiring, and that's why she stopped, I suppose. But I don't really know how she did it. The one thing that she did tell me is that I can still think of plots. She said that's not a problem at all. The problem is actually writing them down.
Yeah.
But I think you're not the only people to be disappointed by the fact that nobody can give you an answer to that question, because she didn't really think of things in those terms. She just did it very naturally.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the best answer to that then. Maybe you get enough people talking about process that it sort of it removes the je ne sais quoi that maybe you have to have in order to produce art. If you're spending so much time talking and thinking about process, you're losing the intangibles perhaps. So
well, I just finished reading John le Carré's biography, not autobiography, but there's an awful lot of him in it. And I think I've read his autobiography as well. And that is about about process and almost nothing else, so to speak. And it's the exact opposite.
Although, in fairness, most of le Carré's novels are about process, right? All of the spy novels are about process.
I'm a huge John le Carré fan, so.
Oh no! I love le Carré, so. But
you could have a whole side. Catherine could not be a bigger le Carré fan.
I ought to tell you then, if you're a big le Carré fan, is that he taught me at school for a couple of years. When I was at Eton, he taught, I forget what, French and one language and history or something like that. And he wasn't the world's best teacher, but we all enjoyed him enormously because he was a very intelligent and very approachable man for a schoolmaster. And, and then he left and gave himself over completely to writing, and probably that was the best thing for him to do. But he was a lovely man.
Well, I appreciate knowing that he's not good at all things. School teaching perhaps not being one of them. All right. So I think that, we had mentioned at the beginning of this that, we were sad that we had not gone to Devon for this actual festival, despite, the convenience of this Zoom. And I think that we want to talk to you a little bit also about Greenway and what it was like to actually live at Greenway, and then, moving it over to a National Trust property and opening it to the public, and the process behind that, as a sort of monument to your grandmother, etc. I guess tell us a little bit about visiting there and growing up there.
Well, Greenway is a bit of an enigma in many ways because I have to say, I spent 8 weeks in the summer there, from the age of 3 or 4 until, very nearly until Nima died, but not quite. And I'm as fond of Greenway as I am of any house other than my original house in Wales, where we moved from 10 or 12 years ago. But it is the most wonderful place, and as Nima said, the most beautiful place in the world. but it is still an enigma because, as you so rightly said, Catherine, everybody sort of treats this as the centre of Agatha Christie, Anya, so to speak, and all this kind of thing. And yet she never wrote a book there, as far as I know. And I all people ought to know that if it was true. It is not true. She never wrote a book there. She did correct scripts, which was, she'd finish a book in May. She'd go down to Greenway in sort of July, and by that stage the proofs were ready, so she'd correct the proofs sitting in the drawing room in the morning. So Greenway, and there is a desk there which features in one of the famous pictures of Nima, but she never wrote a book sitting at her desk, all those kinds of things. It was for her family time, Greenway, and as such, much beloved by her. And of course, it was in the same county as Ashfield, where she grew up. So it was sort of Devon and all those kind of things. But you say, what was it like to live there? The funny thing about Greenway is that since the time that Nima bought it in the late 1930s, this may sound strange to you, but nobody has actually ever lived there. Nima lived there for 8 weeks during the summer, and we all visited at different times of the year and all that kind of thing. And then when Nima died, my parents moved down there, and they lived there for a short time. But then they moved into the little cottage which is on the river opposite Detticham. So they didn't live there. And now, of course, it belongs to the National Trust, and nobody still lives there. But I have to tell you that I think the National Trust have made a marvellous job of it. Some sort of controversy about this, but I did leave them a large part of the contents of the house as well as the house itself. I did this because I thought if we did that, there was more of a chance that they would let it, so to speak, breathe with the life that my family had breathed into it all the years we lived there. Whereas if we'd taken all the contents away, they'd have made it all up. And I'm very pleased that we did that. And Robin Brown, who is the director of the National Trust down there, did a marvellous job with converting it. And I can honestly tell you, the only time that I was ever close to crying about Greenway was when it was being, the roof was in a terrible stage, and for sort of a year, 18 months, it had scaffolding all the way around it and tarpaulins, and it just looked miserable. Scaffolding came off and the tarpaulins came off, and we had this big opening party. This was after my parents had died. And then it suddenly came to life. And people, journalists quite often ask me, do you mind seeing all the people, flooding over Greenway during the summer, and sometimes as many as 800 during a day, visit them and all that kind of thing? The answer is, I don't mind at all, because then Greenway and people communicate again. It was only when there were no people there, and it wasn't like the house that I loved so much when I was young, that I couldn't stand it. But once the people began flowing through it again and taking their dogs there and their children and walking down to the boathouse as I used to do, I was very pleased that we'd given it to them, because I think that was the only way it was going to live properly. And I'm very nervous now what will happen after the virus, and how they'll, so to speak, get back to where they started. But then that doesn't only apply to Greenway.
Right. No, it's an interesting distinction that Greenway is, it's obviously a house, but it was a holiday home, right? Which I know and the idea that people are going on holiday and going to Agatha Christie's house and visiting and kind of interacting with it, and the appropriateness of that is, it feels like a nice legacy. That, yes, I mean, I had the same thought about, what will happen after the virus is done, in terms of the Mousetrap too. Our beloved Mousetrap has been on the West End, but not since March. Like every other show, it's obviously not happening right now. But have to hope that these things pick up.
It is supposed to be opening again on October the 23rd, but with only 200 or 300 people going, which is half the original capacity of the theatre. But I mean, I don't know whether that'll happen or not. But there is, you'll be interested to hear, so the producer told me, there is a rule in the West End Theatre that this is treated just as an intermission, so that the record run will go ahead whenever it starts.
As it should. That's
very good news. But also, you know, of all the things of any production that should be able to just get back up again, you would think it would be the one that had the most institutional memory behind it. It's clearly the sort of best choice of reopening, you know, just because there are so many people with the experience of it and the know-how to get it going again.
Yeah. Well, you know, this isn't a time to expand on my feelings about the virus, but I will tell you one thing, that I'm also involved in another part of my life with an opera company here in Wales, and I don't know, you know, how that opera company is going to live again, because we are told, you've probably heard this too, that there is apparently a problem with the virus and woodwind, that you blow air through a basically what is a wooden tube, and it comes out the other end expanded, and you know, apparently there's a problem about that, and there is all the problem about getting people in and out of theatres, and you know, and what happens on the stage. I mean, you know, how can you keep, you know, 1 meter or 2 meters away from people while you're performing opera? You know, I really don't know how the scientists and the artists are going to make a job of this, and that really worries me, because I'm a huge live drama and live performance fan, and I just don't see how we're going to get that. But that's not what this is about.
Right. I mean, you are a huge benefactor of the arts in Wales, right?
Yes.
Which is a lovely thing. What brought you to Wales?
We're in the south of Wales. We live near a town called Abergavenny, which is not far from the capital, Cardiff, which is where the Welsh National Opera, which I was just talking about, that's where they live. And it tours as well. And that again is a problem, because of course we'll then get bound up with the problems with our regional venues, which are, you know, the worst thing is that they're not the same wherever you go. So what do? If you're trying to tour a Mozart opera, you have to change it whichever venue. Anyway, we must stop.
Well, I would just a final little dovetail on the Greenway question. I think one of the reasons we also were thinking of it is that the book that we've most recently covered, we're going in chronological order. We just covered Dead Man's Folly, which is, of course, you know, suffused with Greenway, and I was also struck by the fact that David Suchet, you know, he wrote this lovely book, Poirot and Me, following the conclusion of the series, and he talks about what an emotional moment it was finishing the filming. It's not the last episode to air, that would be Curtain, obviously, but the last episode to be filmed was Dead Man's Folly at Greenway, and I believe you were there for that.
I was there. You're quite right, and I remember, so to speak, for the rest of my life, that it came to an end, and David Suchet did a sort of walk, you know, with his famous walk from the side of Greenway up to the front door. He knocks on the door, and he did that 3 or 4 times, and then the director said, "And it's a wrap," and that was the end of however many hours Poirot filming there was. And I thought David Suchet was going to, you know, David Suchet and I had a big hug, and we went for a walk down to the boathouse with my dog, and there is a famous picture of David and the dog, and I remember somebody saying, "Oh, you know, your dog is very privileged to have this picture taken with David Suchet," and I said, "You're absolutely wrong. David Suchet is very privileged to have a picture taken with my dog. It's the same dog you saw at the beginning of this performance." but you know, it was a very emotional day, and there were quite a lot of people there. I think the whole cast turned up, and we all had a bit of a celebration afterwards. And I mean, David did such a wonderful job with those. And you know, during the lockdown here, they did all the short stories over again, 7 o'clock every evening. And believe it or not, Lucy and I watched most of them with a glass of wine and some of them were a little bit dated, but you know, quite a lot of them held up very well. And David's performance held up incredibly well because you know Poirot is dated, so that doesn't really matter very much. So, but it was great, and it was amusing for us to. I can't remember any of the examples, but you know, Lucy, who's much better at remembering names than me, sort of kept on looking at the screen, saying, "Isn't that so and so?" And you know, quite a lot of people started early in their careers with a sort of performance in one of David's Poirot stories and became a lot more famous later on. So quite a bit television history.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit of a parlor game, I think, that we play, because you know, we'll watch the episodes, we'll watch the adaptations when we cover the stories or the novels, and so we've been back through all of the ones that we've covered, and you're totally right that it's just pointing at the screen and being like, oh my gosh, it's, you know,
Damian Lewis, we just recently
yeah.
like 23, you know, looking younger than I think I've ever seen him look in anything. Yeah.
Michael Fassbender.
I'm a great Homeland fan. Yes.
I'm just, you know, I'm curious because I think this is something that's often said, and I would be curious to get your confirmation or not on it that, you know, obviously Agatha Christie wasn't around when David Suchet portrayed Poirot or when Joan Hickson portrayed Miss Marple, but that those would probably be the two portrayals of her, you know, her series characters that she would have liked the most. Do you think that that's a fair statement?
I mean, the answer to that question is yes, I do. But I can also tell you that Nima was a genius, and I gave up trying to predict what she thought about any particular subject or play we went to see together. We went to see a lot of operas and Shakespeare and all sorts of things, but she was kind enough to introduce me to when I was young. And we quite often disagreed about things, and in the most friendly possible way. And I do think that she would have liked David's performance as Poirot, and actually in particular Joan Hickson's as Miss Marple, who, you know, I think was absolutely terrific. And I'm always amazed that that BBC show got as few awards as it did, because I thought it was the best television that was produced in this country during the time it was going on. And Joan was absolutely perfect. Even now, I play the famous interview, I think it's in The Body in the Library, with the young schoolgirl. Joan tells her that she's got to tell the truth. I mean, it is a wonderful school mistressy performance, and couldn't have been bettered by anybody. And I'll tell you a little story about Joan, because when the series came to an end, we asked her to a little lunch at a hotel in London, and everybody, you know, we got, you know, George Galaccio, a few directors, and everything like that, and there were about, I suppose, a dozen of us there, but no Joan. So in the end, my mother said, Matthew, you better go make sure she's not just waiting at the, you know, by the front door. So I went, and there she was, waiting by the front door. And I looked at her and I said, Joan, why aren't you coming in? I was hoping somebody would come and fetch me, she said. And then during the whole of lunch, she was well into her 80s then, she tried with all the professionals there, like George and other BBC producers, she was actually cadging for business. It was an amazing sight, you know, but she was great.
She definitely, I don't think anyone else has captured the sort of both sides of Miss Marple, the genius, right? The sort of the genius solver of mysteries, but then also that, you know, the sterner kind of more traditionally conservative aspects of her as well, and contained them within one person. It's just a brilliant performance.
So. Yeah, it was wonderful. I think in particular, I mean, because Nima actually saw her, I think, in a performance of Shakespeare quite a long time before she actually started doing Miss Marple. I believe she actually wrote her a letter saying, one day maybe you may play Miss Marple, something like that.
Yes.
Which turned out to be prophetic.
Yes, no, absolutely. Well, I have to ask a question that we often ask any sort of devotee or expert of Christie, which is what is your favorite Christie? I'm thinking maybe if it makes sense, it might be worth parsing that question. If you might have a different favorite as the longtime head of Agatha Christie Limited, as just a general reader of Christie, as Agatha Christie's grandson, or maybe not. Maybe you have one clear front runner.
Well, I have thought of an answer to that, and the answer is I've got two selections. And the first is a very obvious one. I think I have to name, as sort of chairman of Agatha Christie Limited, and as somebody who was involved for a long time with the management of the property, I have to give the award to Murder on the Orient Express, mainly because not once but twice a performance of Murder on the Orient Express on the screen transformed our property. I mean, it did in the early 1970s when it came. Remember, that came not so very long after the awful MGM films, and that restored the cinematic public and the professionals in charge of spending money on films. It actually restored their confidence in Agatha Christie as a media property, which was of colossal importance, far more important than the actual money we made from the film. It was the reputational thing that really was transformative. And believe it or not, the more recent film, in which Kenneth Branagh played Poirot, had the same effect. And I think the most remarkable thing about that, as far as I was concerned, was, I mean, I think I knew, having seen the film, that it would be popular in America and here, and even in Italy, maybe. But the thing that really amazed all of us was that every country in the world showed this film. They all had 500,000 people, 50,000 people, whatever it was. Every single country in the world, in different languages, and it was a completely worldwide sellout. And for somebody who, had been dead for 40 years or however long it is, I mean, I thought it was a truly remarkable performance. And I think that even 20th Century Fox, as they were called then, were quite amazed at the foreign performance. And we're expecting Death on the Nile in October. Whether or not the virus will let us open in October, I think but it's still scheduled to open in the middle of October. And I'm told by my son, who's actually seen it, I haven't, that it's better than Orient Express. So.
Right.
It has quite the glamorous cast to it.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
I think we're all looking forward to that. It's funny, before the last Murder on the Orient Express opened, I was at a dinner party when we still had those things, and somebody there had in their bag a copy of Murder on the Orient Express, and they said to me, "Oh, have you ever read this book?" And I was trying not to laugh, but at the same time, I was very impressed at the number of people, I think, who had had that exact same experience, that they had heard that this thing was coming. It was a name that they knew that they should have heard of or read, but it was so surprising to me and touching in a way to find adults, in 2018 who were picking up this novel because they knew that they should have read it at some point, and they were so surprised as to what happened in it. And I probably read it when I was 10 years old, so seeing somebody discover it for the first time was kind of remarkable.
I didn't completely answer your question, because actually the book I'd choose as my favorite, as a member of the family and grandson and all that, would actually be different. And you probably, this is not the first time I've said this, but there's a book called Endless Night, which she wrote in the middle 60s, which is, I think, unquestionably my favorite book. Really, for quite apart from the fact I think it's a marvelous book. It was written at a time when we probably knew each other best, and I was sort of growing up, and I used to take my school and university friends to see her in Wallingford, and went away on trips to opera and drama and all that kind of thing. And with all my young friends as well, and they couldn't believe, how approachable Nima and Max were at Wallingford, and Endless Night, as you know, is a story about three young people at roughly the age when I was there. And I've always thought that, she's borrowed little bits and pieces of my friends' characters in order to, make the whole thing. But I do think for somebody in her 70s, which she was when she wrote that book, to write a story of such perspicacity, if that's a word, about people my age, at that age, was a wonderful achievement, and entirely convincing. And it is, I think, by some way my favourite Agatha Christie. It had one slightly disappointing. Well, it had more than one. The film that was made by the Bolting brothers, I think, was slightly disappointing with Howell Bennett, and I can't remember who else was in it. But anyway, it ended up with an actress sort of naked on face up on a pool. But I can forgive all the people there, because for me it will always be a book which I remember with great love and affection, and all the times that I spent with Nima during that period.
Well, I almost think you solved one of the mysteries for us of that book, because I think many people remark on the fact that, a woman who at that point was in her 70s, I think, right? At least in her 70s, how could she write this young man's voice with such confidence and assurance and so convincingly? So the fact that she was interacting with you and your friends, I should have thought of that. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you obviously then also still have to be a genius writer to be able to pull that off. But that exposure from you and your friends is interesting. I never put that together. So that's fascinating.
Oh, well, that isn't something I've dreamt up for your podcast. I mean, that's what actually happened. And we all, I'm sure that three of us went to Salzburg Music Festival together. When we were at Salzburg, the deal was that me and my friends had gone out in a very old Vauxhall car with a sort of room for luggage at the back. And so all four of us piled into this car to go to the opera every evening, and one of us parked the car, and then afterwards we all went out to dinner at a smart restaurant, all dressed in our black ties. And then finally the three of us went back to the local camping site, which is where we were sleeping, so to speak, under canvas every night. And the other people in the camping site couldn't understand what we were doing, and didn't really approve. I remember one of them saying in his best English, "You are not good camping, Leute," he said, and which means I think he thought we ought to have been somewhere else. But anyway, there were all sorts of, and I think somebody different came to Bayreuth with us, but they all, and we all had lunch together, and my friends argued with my grandfather about the philosopher Hegel, and I remember my American friend Ellis saying, I think he knew more about Hegel than I did, because he was studying Hegel at Oxford. And no, they were great days. I always enjoy reminiscing about them.
Absolutely.
I mean, far be it for this feels like asking somebody to choose their favorite child, but I guess the other question that we always have to ask everybody is it Poirot or Marple? If you have to pick one, are you a Poirot person or a Marple person?
I am actually a Marple person.
Yes.
I think Joan Hickson helped a bit, but I am actually a Marple person. And the early Marple books, Murder at the Vicarage and Body in the Library, and I admit A Murder is Announced, which might be my favourite. It's not a particularly early one, but the early two, I think, are such wonderful stories. that I have to be a Marple person. But if you ever tell David, I'll kill you.
You have made my life. I can't say day. I can't even say year. I'm done. I'm just done.
Cumber's overjoyed.
I am the Marple acolyte of the pair. Catherine's love will always lie with Papa Poirot. So
It will. although I think Murder at the Vicarage might be in my top 5 Christies. I love Murder at the Vicarage.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I'll tell you, I will be very enigmatic, and not even you can know the answer to this question. But all I can tell you is that you and I, who are Marple people, in the next 2 or 3 years, may receive a very happy surprise.
Ooh. All right.
Intriguing.
That is
I
very
can't say any more than that.
All right. Well, that is, I think, and what better way to end this interview than on an intriguing, somewhat suspenseful note.
A mystery note.
Well, this has been such a delight. I mean, again, just a dream opportunity for us to be able to speak with you about Agatha Christie as a writer, but even as a person and as your grandmother, it's just something that we didn't even think would be possible when we started doing our podcast 4 years ago. Going through every single text with a fine-toothed literary comb as we do. So we will continue to do that. And this is, I think for me anyway, given me even more context for what I love about her and what she does. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you too. And believe it or not, I do like talking about Nima. I know we had a sort of business relationship, but I never thought of it like that. During all the years that I've had things to do with her books and her life and all that kind of things, I never forget that actually I was very fond of her.
Absolutely.
So there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matthew.